Objectivity can be a tricky concept when dealing with video games. There's this notion that criticism should strive to always be as objective as possible, but oftentimes, art is more complicated than binaries such as good or bad, right or wrong. Techniques that are effective for some games might not work well for others. Look at fetch quests, for example. Getting the pieces of the Triforce in Wind Waker is a complete chore and easily the worst part of that game, but at the same time, most players think the Enju and Cafe side quest is the emotional highlight of Majora's Mask, even though it involves a lot of waiting around. It's all about how it's framed in the narrative. For another example, look at how underwater physics are completely out of place in the first Sonic game, but are used as a natural roadblock in Super Metroid. My point is to say that even mechanics that are considered boring and frustrating can be used to great effect in different scenarios. To label the entire mechanic as bad based on some games using it poorly can be really limiting. It's what happened to escort missions at one point, and now most games that feature companions try to get around this quote-unquote issue by making them invincible. This is very convenient for players, but goes against the cohesiveness of a given work. Of course, I'm not saying we should get rid of objectivity entirely, as it's always important to back up your statements with concrete evidence. But the idea that a game's quality could be objectively measured using some predetermined metrics is something that never really sat well with me personally. With that in mind, I think it's important to understand that even games that are considered mediocre or even bad in terms of traditional game design might still excel in other areas and can occasionally provide substantial new ways of looking at the medium. It's no secret The Last Guardian is a divisive game. It sports some truly baffling design decisions which go against not only the perceived rules of good game design, but also against what Fumito Ueda's previous games were all about, with its giant button prompts that never go away and bad camera framing. That being said, it's also a game that aspires to lofty goals, in terms of organic and emotionally charged AI interactions, which feels not only like a natural progression of Team Ico's previous works, but also like something the industry has been striving for with its biggest story-focused AAA titles recently. The objective of this video is to look at the game's biggest achievements and in the process learn about what it set out to explore and how it tried to push the medium in a different direction. I won't try to convince anybody who felt like the game wasn't good to think otherwise, but I will be diving mostly into its strengths rather than its flaws. Hopefully, this will make those who felt disappointed understand where the other side of the argument comes from, even if it doesn't necessarily change their minds. This video will contain spoilers and is better understood if you've played the game, so you've been warned. Many people have noted how The Last Guardian seems to be a mix between the premises of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, in the sense that instead of forming a bond with a young girl or murdering giant monsters, the player is tasked with forming a bond with a giant monster. Which makes me wonder if Ueda's next game will be about murdering young girls. But I digress. Bad jokes aside, while there is a degree of truth to this idea, as stated by Ueda himself, the final product shares a lot more similarities with his debut title than his sophomore effort. This is mainly due to both Ico and The Last Guardian focusing on the concept of companionship, even if the manners in which they do it are more different than they may initially appear. To better understand how these games differentiate themselves from one another, we need to look at how the construction of the relationship with Trico compares to the one with Yorda. The first immediate difference between the two is how much more there is to the animal in terms of varying ways players can interact with it. While the only interactions available with Yorda were holding hands and calling for her, in The Last Guardian the boy can climb Trico and call for him, but also feed him optional barrels, remove spears, and pet the animal. This last action in particular can cause different effects on Trico depending on the part of the body the player pets. It also allows the boy to clean up blood and straighten the creature's ruffled feathers. From what I could find, there's conflicting information about whether these small interactions have any effect on how Trico behaves, but I would argue their inclusion is a success regardless. If there is an effect, then the game is rewarding players who take care of the animal with a more responsive companion. While on the other hand, if these mechanics are ineffective, they still allow players to express their feelings towards Trico in an organic manner. You don't pet him because you want to get something out of him, you pet him for the same reason you'd pet any animal, to show genuine affection. That being said, the biggest way players will interact with Trico is by issuing commands, which can easily be considered the core mechanic of the game, but it's not introduced until about 20% of the way through. This first fifth of the game is more focused on letting players familiarize themselves with Trico's behavior and introducing the different gameplay types they will face on their journey through the nest. The purpose of withholding the ability to issue commands for so long is to provide players with an appreciation for the trust that's forming between the characters once the mechanic is introduced. Many of the initial puzzles would be completely trivial if the player could simply climb on Trico's back and show him where to go, but instead you're forced to platform your way to the next room so he will follow you. Either that, or you have to trick him into getting into a favorable position before proceeding by using his body as a platform. In this early part of the adventure, the mirror is the only reliable way of forcing Trico to do exactly what you want, which fits into the theme of control we'll dive into a little later in the video, but for now, suffice it to say that the reliability of this item is an exception, which can be explained by its presumed origin and purpose relating to the game's central villain, the Master of the Valley. At any rate, once you finally get the ability to tell Trico what to do, situations that would otherwise be puzzles to try to get him into the right position become a simple question of traversal. Once this happens, it may seem like the game is taking some of the player's agency and participation away, and that's because in a certain way, it really is. Much like Ico before it, The Last Guardian's core is built around creating a bond with an AI companion, but unlike that game where the player held the most responsibility and had to escort their companion, the roles in this new game are somewhat reversed. Players are placed in a vulnerable position and must rely on their partner constantly, making for an experience that focuses on disempowerment. At first, the game gives you this illusion of an environment you can traverse mostly on your own and a companion that needs you more than you need him. But as you make progress, it becomes more and more apparent how the boy is frail and powerless compared to Trico. Later levels are filled with these impossibly tall structures only the creature can climb. And while Trico still needs you to calm him down after a fight, as well as to get rid of the glass eyes that terrify him, ultimately, you're as useful to him as Ueda was to Ico. In this manner, The Last Guardian is the polar opposite of Ueda's first game, as it places the player in the role of the one who needs to be protected. One clear parallel between these games can be drawn in these segments where the player needs to make a jump the boy is clearly not capable of making on his own and hope Trico will catch them on the other side. Immediately, this brings to mind the segments where Ico had to catch Ueda, but now we see it from the other perspective. The one key difference is how in that game, Ico would never fail to catch the girl, meanwhile the same cannot be said for The Last Guardian. The fact Trico can miss the boy if players make the jump before the creature is actually ready to catch them is one of the clever ways the game emphasizes how much you need to trust him. If he always caught the boy without fail, there would be no hesitation for the player to overcome. This is another example of something that wouldn't work in one game being used to emphasize a certain experience in another, as there's no gameplay reason why Ico should fail in these scenarios, but allowing Trico to do so evokes the intended feeling for the player. This empowerment is also the point of a couple of segments where the boy is trapped, first in this tree and later in this cage. I've talked about sequences meant to evoke powerlessness in my Shadow of the Colossus analysis, and a lot of the same ideas apply here as well. More specifically, how these moments are made all the more effective by giving players just enough control to make them think they can overcome the obstacle on their own, despite having a predetermined outcome. I can only speak from personal experience, but the first time I was stuck in this tree, I spent a long time trying to figure out a rhythm that would allow me to swing myself off the branch. I tried calling Trico as well, but since the beast didn't seem to know what to do either, I figured it was up to me to free myself. Only after taking way longer than I probably should did I resort to asking for Trico's help again. Admittedly, I felt frustrated upon stumbling into such a simplistic solution to what I thought was some sort of challenging puzzle. But looking back on it, it's obvious the game included this segment to showcase how dependent of your companion you really are. Similarly, the sequence where the boy is trapped in the cage also gives you enough control and freedom of movement to make you think there's a puzzle to be solved, but in reality the game won't move forward until you call for help. Some additional examples of being powerless are also present when the boy first arrives at the Sentinel Tower and in the first two antenna rooms. One interesting thing to note is how the boy is constantly at the mercy of Trico as the game goes on, but the beast gets progressively more and more powerful. Trico gains the ability to shoot lightning, the ability to fly, and the power to resist the antenna. But most important of all, in a couple of spots, he can actively break the rules set by the game. The point where every player will get to see this in action is during this trap when you first arrive at the Sentinel Tower. But some might experience this a bit earlier in this puzzle where you need to knock down the armors holding the glass eye shields in order for Trico to jump on the balcony and kill the enemies. In these moments where Trico overcomes his fear to save the boy, the game breaks its own rules to showcase how their bond is getting stronger. The moment in the balcony is particularly interesting because it's not scripted. Some players won't see this, which makes Trico's bravery feel all the more genuine. In a lot of ways, Trico is the true protagonist of the game, and the way he's constantly growing stronger somewhat reflects that. Now, this is not to say the boy is as helpless as Ueda was in Eco, as he has the ability to point the animal in the right direction, feed him when he's too hungry or weak to go on, and remove spears from his body. There are also segments where the boy must perform platforming challenges on his own, and if you're skilled enough, you can in fact kill the armors without Trico's help. But the truth is that the character that progresses and gets stronger throughout the experience is Trico, and not the player. Looking at it in this manner, The Last Guardian can be seen as an experiment on placing players as supporting characters instead of as the main focus of the work. Games usually don't do this because main characters are the ones that drive the plot forward with their actions, which is a trait that lends itself well to an interactive role. The Last Guardian, however, chooses to go in a different direction, which brings with it unique design challenges, not least of which is how do you give players an interactive experience when they're placed in such a submissive role? And for the answer, we need to look at the way the game handles controls. More than just a mix of Ueda's previous works, The Last Guardian can be seen as a logical step forward in terms of using controls as a storytelling device, which is one particular technique that Ueda seems to have been slowly developing from game to game over the years. It began as a simple gesture in Eco. The decision to make players have to hold down the button in order to hold Ueda's hand may not have felt like much at the time, but the way I see it, it shows a fundamental understanding of how controls are an abstraction of physical movement. So holding R1 is symbolically representing the act of holding hands as a continuous action. Using the same button to call for Ueda also helps in permanently associating that part of the controller with that specific character. Similar to what Brothers did many years later, once that character is gone, a part of the controller becomes useless, and in this manner, their absence can be physically felt. This creates an abstraction of the protagonist's feelings of loss, giving us a better understanding of the characters we play as. This association of a character with a part of the controller is equally true for Agro in Shadow of the Colossus, but the concept is expanded through the way players control her movement. The horse's independence is conveyed not only by the way she moves through the environment on her own, but also through Wonder's limited control over her, especially in comparison to other video game horses. Through the controls, we get to feel and understand her as autonomous, which reinforces her unwavering loyalty. To understand how The Last Guardian takes these concepts one step further, we need to take a slight detour and look at how the basic controls for main characters work in all three games. This is made very easy by the fact that the mapping of actions to buttons has remained largely the same across the years. Triangle is always used to jump, square is used to attack, circle is used for context-sensitive actions such as picking up objects or pulling down levers, and X is generally used for descending, except in Shadow of the Colossus where it's used to call aggro instead, as there's rarely a moment you want to drop down in that game. This consistency allows us to see the buttons as abstractions for their respective actions. So controlling the boy feels pretty similar to Echo and Wonder, and much like it was with Yorda, the R1 button is heavily associated with Trico. So when the time comes to give him commands, the game creates a sort of syntax language by combining these features. For example, if you want the boy to jump, you press triangle, the jump button. But if you want to tell Trico to jump, all you need to do is combine the Trico button with the jump button. This reinforces the boy as a proxy for the player and Trico as a separate entity, almost like an evolution of what was done with aggro. It's a very elegant and intuitive way of allowing players to communicate with the animal. For every action the boy can perform, an R1 modifier can be used to tell Trico to perform that same action. Following that logic, it's pretty easy to understand how R1 plus directions tells Trico to move, R1 plus triangle tells him to jump, R1 plus square tells him to attack, and R1 plus circle points to objects which he can interact with. X is the only one that doesn't seem quite as intuitive, since R1 plus X tells Trico to sit, and I think it calls his attention, sort of like a forget everything you're doing and listen to what I'm about to say type of reset for his AI, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. Regardless, what this does is create an array of possibilities that emulate how you would interact with a real animal. The controls become a method for communication. The concept of communication can be broken into four basic components: the sender, the message, the receiver, and the feedback. Based on this breakdown, we can easily assign which aspects of the game fit into each component. The sender is represented by the player, or the boy depending on how you want to look at it. The message is what you tell Trico to do with your controller, and the receiver is the creature itself. The feedback is given based on whether or not he understands the message. What this means is that the core gameplay of The Last Guardian is essentially a gamification of how we communicate, where the challenge resides in making ourselves understood. Many games with branching dialogue trees and consequences-driven narratives try to find a way of translating conversations into mechanics, but I would say none do so in such an elegant manner as this one, because of how it's so intrinsically tied to the basic actions of our character. Going back to the comparison between the boy and Yorda, using commands to guide Trico reminds me of the torch puzzle in that game, where Yorda tries to hint at the solution, but it's up to players to actually notice it. In The Last Guardian, there's a role reversal, where players are the ones who must point to the right directions for Trico, but ultimately the creature needs to understand things for itself. There are segments where he'll go towards the intended destination without any input at all from the player, while other times he'll be completely lost even though the boy is constantly trying to show him the way. It's a frustrating position to be left in, as it might evoke feelings of inadequacy and dependency, which can only be overcome by patience and understanding. As the game progresses, attentive players will start to learn the quirks that indicate whether Trico understands their commands or not, so this system works well towards making the creature feel truly real. These kinds of feelings are rarely explored in games, but here they make up the core of the experience. I don't mean to discredit people who point out the many flaws of the game, but part of me can't help but wonder whether part of the reason it didn't click with some people is because of how uncommon it is for a game to ask players to play a supporting role. To be placed in a secondary position is the antithesis of traditional game design, as it robs players of their agency to overcome obstacles on their own. Any feeling of empowerment the player might feel in The Last Guardian is only provided by proxy through Trico, but isn't necessarily bad because it goes against what gamers are used to. I don't think so. Because in a lot of aspects, The Last Guardian sports more artistically honest versions of quite a few AAA trends. This entire video has been about how the game builds an AI companion without making them invincible or infallible. But for another example, the big action set pieces filled with destructible terrain found in games like Uncharted and the new Tomb Raiders are also present here, and they are about as interactive as the ones in those games tend to be, which is to say not that much. But since the game frames you as a helpless participant in these events, while Trico does all the heavy lifting, it feels more honest about the dangers the player is facing. Whereas this scene in Uncharted 3 looks like a really intense moment for Drake, all you really have to do is press forward, creating a sort of disconnect these games try to remedy with music and visual spectacle. By placing the players in the backseat of its set pieces, The Last Guardian allows the mechanical complexity to be low without creating this disconnect. All of that is great, but personally the game's biggest achievement in terms of re-examining AAA trends is how it manages the near impossible feat of making QuickTime events actually meaningful. QTEs are something that I never understood because they never seem to add anything to a work. Most of the time, the game would have been better off if the cutscene just played out normally. The infamous press F to pay respects meme is made fun of because of how it trivializes what was meant to be a respectful gesture towards a fallen comrade. Taking such a meaningful act and placing it in a game that's all about the joy of killing faceless enemies feels misguided at best. The QTE is just pouring salt on the wound at this point for how shallow, unnecessary, and disconnected from the rest of the game it truly is. Up until recently, I would say there was never any case where a QuickTime event added anything to a game. So I was really surprised when I realized The Last Guardian not only ends with a kind of QuickTime event, but also makes it incredibly impactful. When I pointed out the failings of Advanced Warfare, I wasn't just trying to beat a dead horse. I did it because we can use it as a framework to justify why The Last Guardian succeeds where so many others have failed. Its use of QTE is meaningful as opposed to shallow because it recontextualizes the main mechanic of the game. Here, you're not just directing Trico in order to make progress, you're trying to save his life and saying a final goodbye in the process. But is it necessary? Couldn't it just have been a cutscene like so many other QTEs could have? Well, its usefulness is in terms of coherence. After all, this QuickTime event is the glue that ties the emotional climax of the game to its core mechanics. Which means it's also connected to the rest of the game by using the same language you've been using throughout the journey. Because despite the game's bizarre obsession with button prompts, this final sequence can get completely rid of them. It trusts players will understand how they can tell Trico to leave by pressing the buttons they've been using the whole game. The ending signifies the end of your adventures with Trico, so what better way to cap off a game about communication than with an emotionally charged farewell? Most people I've seen seem to agree that this final stretch is the game's absolute best moment. And I believe a lot of the reasons why are based on the concepts we've gone through in this video. But there's one last subject I would like to tackle before closing things off. What The Last Guardian means for its own creator. When discussing what was, at the time, the incoming release of his new game, Fumito Ueda stated how difficult it was to say goodbye to Trico after working on The Last Guardian for so many years. Because of this, part of me wonders if the boy could be seen as a self-insertion, even though he's also clearly meant to be a mostly blank canvas for players to project themselves into. Ueda has denied this idea in the same interview with Geoff Keighley, stating the boy was not a representation of himself, but he also said that after working on the game for so long, he did feel like he was the owner of Trico in some ways. Regardless of conscious intent, a lot of the elements in the plot of the game lead me to believe that the central themes ended up reflecting a lot of the director's anxieties for the project. This is clearly expressed in the game's central conflict of nature versus technology, which is portrayed in a variety of ways throughout the journey. For example, the contrast between the Sentinel Tower and the rest of the structures is a pretty evident way of showcasing how the main tower represents technology. While the stone spires are in ruins after presumably being abandoned for ages, the Sentinel Tower stands in an uncanny intact state, and seems to be made of a material that envelops older structures, evoking the idea of the new replacing the old. It also sports a variety of technological features, such as an antenna, a refrigeration system, fans, and floating elevators. From the moment players leave the game's introductory cave, Trico runs past the boy and screams at the tower, indicating some sort of pre-existing conflict, which is constantly reinforced as the creature will howl at the structure almost every opportunity he gets. Later we learn that whatever the Master of the Valley is, it uses Tricos in order to capture people. The most accepted theory is that these sacrifices are made in order to keep whatever is buried in the sarcophagus alive, while the substance in the barrels is a byproduct of using humans to keep the mysterious being from dying. This theory is kind of confirmed in the companion book, The Last Guardian: An Extraordinary Story. So for the purposes of this video, I think we can assume the person inside the sarcophagus is the Master's true body. Its association with the white material from the Sentinel Tower puts it as an embodiment of technology. If the Master represents the artificial, Tricos are clearly meant to be a representation of the natural. From the very beginning, these creatures are associated with many different animals, and their unique design and behaviors are an amalgamation of dogs, cats, and birds. There's even somewhat of a beehive mentality to how they go out of the nest, capture people, and bring them back to feed the game's villain. In more ways than one, the Master is trying to bend nature to its will, by controlling the Tricos and keeping itself alive indefinitely. As I mentioned before, the mirror item also hints at this theme of control. The companion book elaborates on how the item works by stating that it's paired to a specific Trico, kind of like a Bluetooth device, which is why our Trico is the only one that responds to it. Aside from being another symbolic representation of technology, the fact this mirror was buried with the Master seems to hint this was another way he tried to control the Tricos. The boy is accidentally caught in the middle of this conflict between nature and technology, with the latter being portrayed as a force that seeks only to perpetuate itself without regard for others. And while it may seem like the typical condemnation of technology, the actual message seems to be more in line with one of coexistence instead of the abandonment of any sort of man-made advancements. This is reinforced by the central relationship and levels of understanding required to make progress. It's about combining the strength of the animal with the boy's capacity for rational thought, which is translated into the puzzles the players must solve throughout the adventure. When we break down the plot's basic elements, this is a story of a boy caught between an untamable independent creature and the force that seeks to control it, where he must learn to coexist with the beast without necessarily taming it, putting him on the opposite side of the spectrum in relation to the villain. Looking at it this way, we can trace a parallel with how Fumito Ueda approached the design of the game. The director stated multiple times how striking a balance between Trico's autonomy and the player's control was one of the major challenges for the project. So even if he had no intention of doing it, it seems to me the story came out as a sort of meta-narrative about the very way the game was designed. Ueda had to find the right balance between making Trico feel real and trying to provide a good experience for players. The end result seems to understand that if the goal was to make players consider Trico as a real animal, then there's little to be gained by trying to bend the game's design to our will. After all, nature is not always subservient to mankind. Earlier I said Trico symbolize nature, but another way to look at it is that they are man-made creatures, which would explain why their design is just a mix of different kinds of animals and why they're so susceptible to being controlled. But since life is a natural phenomenon, they are instinctively rebellious when given the opportunity. This interpretation still retains the idea that nature can't be controlled. The only way to have a productive relationship with it is through coexistence, which is symbolized here by the gameplay in how players are not given full control over the companion. He's meant to be an animal, not a tool or a toy. This interpretation falls even more in line with the idea of there being some metatextual relation between the plot and the game's design process. Because in some ways, Fumito Ueda did set out to play God when he decided to create a new animal, but ultimately allowed himself to give it the autonomy to act freely despite of what players might think of his game. Through this lens, we can also interpret the reason the game is told as a flashback from the boy, now a full-grown adult. Having been shaped by his interactions with Trico, he has become wiser and more experienced, and is now ready to pass his knowledge to a new generation. Again, this could reflect the perspective Ueda has of his own work. The process of trying to make this creature fit into his plans for the project made him more aware of the nature of his work and of the medium itself. And at that point in time, he was finally ready to let players experience for themselves what this new and different perspective on gaming storytelling could be. In a 2014 indie development conference, Jonathan Blow, the designer behind Braid and The Witness, said that when designing what he refers to as deep work, one of the main ways in which developers end up sabotaging themselves is by child-proofing their game's more controversial ideas. In other words, the process of dumbing down potentially unpopular mechanics and concepts ends up robbing the work of the qualities that make it unique. And as a result, the ideas being explored inevitably fall short of their true potential. It usually results in a game that forces its way into being something that's not supported by the game's core design principles. The initial concept for The Last Guardian began as a deeper dive into one aspect of Shadow of the Colossus that unexpectedly resonated a lot with that game's players. It was about building a relationship with an animal, but the paths it ended up taking, and how it ended up conveying new ideas about what roles gamers take when playing their games, and how to gamify communication, were probably unexpected. In my opinion, it's a sign of good design that the team allowed the ideas to flow into a natural destination instead of trying to find a way to make Trico always pleasant and always subservient in order to make sure players like him. Good game design is not fixed on a measurable scale. The Last Guardian has some grotesque flaws, but few games can do what it does. At the end of the day, its mistakes are present in many other games. Its missteps are mostly unremarkable. However, its achievements, those are truly something extraordinary.